Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. This is the Overdose, Grief, Loss, and Healing Supports web training. This is brought to you by the Northeast Caribbean Addiction Technology Transfer Center Network. My name is Diane Padilla, and I will be your presenter for the next little while. So this is the team I'm part of. This is Patricia Chappell. If you've been here before, then you know that she's the one who takes care of the logistics, the administrative logistics. So she will be sending you the certificates, the logistics. She's going to ask you to fill out the evaluation if you haven't done it here today. So she follows through with you on that. Mr. Frederick is my silent partner here. And so he's always behind the scenes. He administers all these platforms, all these web trainings. And so if you have any tech issues, he's under the Northeast Caribbean ATTC name in the Dropbox from the chat. And as you can see, I'm a research project manager. I am a technical assistance and implementation specialist. I am a registered trainer for the ASAP, for peer recovery specialist. I do on a variety of different things under the Northeast Caribbean Addiction and Prevention Technology Transfer Centers. So I also provide organizations, capacity building supports around ESPER, or screening, brief intervention, referral treatment, anything having to do with DEI, whereas it has to do with advancing equity inclusion and all kinds of things in between. And so this is a disclaimer that we're required to include. We are funded by SAMHSA, but it is our responsibility to make sure that the information we give you is accurate, it's current, it is the latest that we know. And so it's our job to bring it and disseminate it to you. And so the technology transfer centers themselves are really SAMHSA's response to workforce development support. And so in order to keep your credentials and in order to for you to continue to do what you're doing, so SAMHSA funds us to provide you different types of training, technical assistance initiatives, and other type of activities that can help you and the staff and colleagues hold on to and increase your knowledge base, your skill set, and hold on to or credential or renew your credentials for the work that you do. So it's really about, helping you and organizations include or incorporate effective practices in either mental health, prevention, and recovery support and treatment. Always start with this. This is going to be part of the presentation. It's one way or another. It's always part of it. You will hear me speak to certain terms in a very specific way. I try to mirror the people first language, and this is what we encourage. And so any one of us who have been working in the field for a long time, there's a lot of terms we're used to using. What we try to help people to think about and consider or commit to is to be intentional with the wording, to not kind of use it just because it's a habit, but be very specific about how the words that you use when you're interacting with your clients, so you can help them understand or they can feel that you're really being supportive and not judgmental. And some of the terms that we were taught to use, now have changed. We've been learning a lot. So we're doing different today. We are trying to be mindful of of how we support our clients. And so we try to use people first language and any motivating, affirming language to help promote not just our practices, but to promote recovery and wellness with the clients. That's what we're seeking to improve on. So the name of this training is Overdose, Grief, Loss, and Healing Support. So it does provide an opportunity to have a discussion. And I always love when you folks bring your perspectives. It just makes the case for the topic that much more important, because it's really about seeing it very from a realistic perspective in what you do and what you experience in your setting. So what's real for you? So I'm pretty good with the research. I'm pretty good with the numbers, and I will bring you some of the recent data. But what does that translate to in terms of what you do and the people you see? So that's important. So let's kind of bring it together. And if you don't mind, if you can help me out with that, it's just a matter of just having a conversation. Are you folks okay with that? Yeah, cool. Okay, that's neat. So one of the things I want to express is the importance of us keeping a safe space. And so a safe space also includes maybe talking from the I perspective. The things that you're experiencing, the things that you may say supervise with your staff, the things that you have been supervised on, the policies and protocols may change by settings. And so it's not really about judgment. It's really about, what are we doing and what can we help each other understand that can be, realistically effective in our settings, which are very, very similar. And so bringing that realistic experience is going to be really valuable for this topic. I also dare say that this topic can sometimes have some of our own personal experience, this might be a voice for you if you wanted to. I want you to feel safe. This is not a place to have judgment, but this might be a place where you can share some of your, because I'll ask these kind of questions, some of the experiences that you have had that affect you as a person, not just with you, with that professional hat. So I'm always so good at trying to okay, these are the emerging issues. This is what we got to train our folks with. This is what we're going to help them with so they can continue to be effective with the client community. Today, this is about you. So that's really important. I know we talk about self-care, but this takes a little bit, maybe more of a deeper dive. So we can be as objective and as grounded as possible to do the work that you do. That work that you do is not easy. And I'm not talking about the logistical side. I'm thinking about the empathetic side, the part of you that you put at risk every single day, And I know that's kind of a funny way to put it, putting it at risk. Well, actually, that's kind of part of it. So we're going to talk about that. So the goals today to review potential effects and impact an overdose can have on staff. We're going to go through the clients and residents. I have a very small time to do that because I don't do a major portion of that here. The major focus here is what happens with staff, but a lot of what we can do for ourselves can translate in the activities we can do for what clients might actually experience behind a peer's overdose. The other thing is to introduce the postvention, opioid postvention responses. For many people, it's the first time they've ever heard that postvention, the term, let alone know what it means, and we're going to talk about that today. And these are responses the organizations can consider incorporating to provide staff with the support and resources they need to kind of process their grief and heal. And so I'm going to start with my steps because this is what I do. And I just, and I thought it was really important to kind of speak to some of the things of why we're doing what we're doing, why these initiatives that we've engaged in the last few years have really taken place. With some of the, and I want you to consider this from the perspective of what do you see, who's your community that you're working with? And wherever you are, you could be upstate New York, upstate, or some rural area in New Jersey. You could be in some rural area in Texas. Texas is a huge state. There's a lot of places that have a lot of distant geographical areas where we see some of the numbers that may not necessarily match you. But I'm going to bring it together for you. Some of the data that we collected in 2020 actually had to do with some of the, this was actually a fact sheet that was done. The NPR gathered this data in 2022, but this was talking about the patterns that were documented, that were noted and documented in 2020. And so 44% of, there was a 44% increase in overdose rates within the Black community. Interestingly enough, an 86% increase in the Black youth. I don't have the youth numbers for Indigenous people, but I do know that 40% of American Indian, Alaska Native people had the increased rates for overdose deaths, overdoses. I'm sorry, getting tongue-tied here. We saw a 22% increase among the white community and a 34% increase amongst the white youth. We saw a 21% increase for Hispanic people, and these are adults that I'm first referring to, and then 51% increase amongst youth. So another emerging trend that we're looking at and probably dealing with to some extent is youth. And youth can be adolescents, youth can be young adults. And young adults anywhere from 18 to 25 are likely being seen in your adult programs. I don't know if folks are working with youth here, but you also have programs that are working with folks in the adolescent stages. And so the steep rise in deaths among Black and Indigenous people far outpace what has been seen with the white community. But the numbers show trends. They don't capture absolutely everything, but this really speaks to why we got funded to do so many different things that we're currently doing now that we weren't doing 5 years ago. So something that I noticed that was interesting, when I last presented this information, we have provisional data, and this came out June 5th, 2020. And so we see the increase in overdose death rates. And so In January 2022, you see a slight decline. The issue with that, and just to bring a realistic perspective to this, is that these are national numbers. Just last week, we started to see numbers different in New York City. So I work for the Northeast Caribbean ATTC, which covers HHS Region 2. That's New York, that's New Jersey, that's Caribbean Islands, that's Puerto Rico. Some of these numbers, again, is going to speak to what you might see, what might be contrasting from the national numbers and what you might see in your individual geographical area. And so the national numbers don't necessarily grasp what is happening locally. So I happen to have this because this is local and this is under our grant. And so I wanted to share this with you. New York City rates of overdose rates are the highest they've been since 2000. There were more overdose deaths in 2021 than they were in 2020. And remember, you know, the whole environment was dealing and reeling from what was going on with the pandemic when we didn't know much of anything. And just when we started to like also broaden our focus with the overdoses that had already started happening in 2019, by the way, and started to increase in 2020. So these are the numbers that have increased over time. And in there were 2,600, over 2,600 deaths in 2021, more than it was the year before in this city. Now, what's interesting is that they took even a closer look and gathered some data. They see that a lot of the rates are going on within the 5 counties in the Bronx, the 5 counties that include New York, the Bronx, Manhattan, Staten Island, and Brooklyn. And so the Bronx has had the highest rates of these overdoses. And so what we also see is that in the high poverty rates also have the highest numbers. When you consider some of the groups that are being affected, it depends on who your demographics are. And so in some areas, like for instance, you are in upstate New York and you're somewhere area somewhere, maybe you're in Washington, maybe you're in Oregon, maybe you're in Idaho, wherever you are, whatever the community is, depending, you know, sometimes the poverty level is the perspective you want to look at and understand where this is happening. And so you start to notice that the people that are coming in have certain commonalities. And so whether they're under the poverty level, whether they're racial and ethnic group, whether they're non-binary, whether they are a certain cohort, because we're also seeing in New York City, a lot of the overdose deaths are amongst people between the ages of 55 and 64. So all of this is to say that you got to look at who's the community that you're serving. Who have you been seeing? If you're seeing this, the way to make this data relevant to what you're doing is to be aware that this may be an issue with the folks that you're working with. So this can inform the kind of questions that you ask. Are you eliciting information about the risk factors in their world? You know, the things that can potentially, you know, increase their vulnerability to a recurrence, you know, and so much more. So that's how the data becomes relevant to us, and we make it important for us to know, okay, this represents my community. This lets me know it hasn't gotten better. They have more challenges, and what else do we have to look for? So that's from that perspective. And all of this is speaking to all the initiatives that we have. You know, since 2020, we have seen funding like never before. We have the Healing Initiative where they funded 4 different states: Ohio, Kentucky, I believe it's Massachusetts, and New York. Amongst the highest rates of overdoses were within these 4 states. And so we have initiatives that are funding organizations to identify the most effective practices, and ultimately the goal would be to reduce overdoses by 40%. Pretty ambitious, but that is part of the funding initiative that came through because these rates are so astronomically high. The other things that we're doing is a lot of states have been suing pharmaceutical companies from back in the time where they had misled a lot of the medical field into prescribing medications, over-prescribing medications and making folks think that there wasn't an addictive property to it. And so because some of these litigations have resulted in some monies coming in and are being rerouted into our programs. This is just, I took this from one of the headlines that came out from New York City, And I'm sure that different states can, we can speak to that as well. So 89 million to be distributed to New York City from historic opioid settlements. We also have a variety of other things. Good Samaritan law, substance use treatment, psychosocial services have evolved. We have the peer recovery support services and specialists who are all helping to augment our work and service provision, providing and widening the scope of interventions and opportunities and pathways for recovery for folks who have substance and opioid use disorders. We have naloxone. We talk about medication for opioid use disorder, which used to be called MAT. Some people still call it MAT. I call it, try to use people first language. So medication for opioid use disorder, or for peer recovery specialists, you might refer to it as the pharmaceutical intervention. You might look at it as a medicated supported recovery. So we have education, we have training for providers and community members, more now than we've had before. We have a lot of your agencies have been funded and been very resourceful and creative in how you outreach to the communities, even for folks who are not necessarily in your office, accessing your services. You're letting folks know that you're there and you're doing different outreach, community outreach efforts. And that's absolutely amazing. We have really stepped it up, quite a bit, because the funding has allowed us to do that. So you notice how I kind of get excited when I start to talk about all these wonderful things, right? Maybe I do get a little hyped. So I'm going to help you translate that energy that I kind of reflect, right, to what you might probably doing in your work, in your world, and what you do. They added more to what you were currently doing, that you were doing before. So you're pretty busy, and you're always doing a lot of different things, different cases that you have to document, different staff that you have to supervise, the peers, so many different people that you have to meet where they're at. You have to use your skills very specifically, everything. There's a lot of staffing. There's so many responsibilities, so many different areas to reach out to people, and so on and so on and so on. And then you're facilitating group, and you're doing all kinds of things. And then comes along, and then we start, and then as much as we are doing, and as much as you're reaching out to the community, what's happened? Every once in a while we hear of somebody's loss. Every once in a while we hear there's an overdose. And I know this is really targeting overdose deaths, people who do transition, do not survive. But there's also folks, and I have colleagues who are doing direct services just like you. When you hear about somebody who is in a hospital because they overdosed and you still don't know whether they survived or not, even that in that transitional period that doesn't get captured in the data, how does that affect you? So I'm going to ask you to risk yourself for a moment and put one word or two words that can describe, and you can think about it for a few seconds, that can describe the feeling that you get the last time that you found out that someone overdosed and transpired, whether or not they were on your client caseload, and put that in the chat box. So look at this. Burdened, heartbroken, devastated, sad, frustrated, discouraged, powerless, defeat, devastated, helpless, sad, frustrated. Frustrated is a big one. Sometimes surprised, isn't that interesting? Crushed. And with somebody I knew, I can't describe the feeling, shaking, nausea. Wow. Yep. Anger. Feel like feel that's their support system. So crushed, she was so close to obtaining housing. Failure. There's a lot of our perceptions that we see of where the person may be at, and sometimes the shock comes to us, but the impact that we have. I say burn because we're missed opportunity to support, and sad and sorry. Thank you. Thank you all for doing that. I really appreciate that. For you to risk yourself there for a moment. So here's the thing. So when you're feeling these feelings, you're going through your own emotions. And as providers, aren't we supposed to be person-centered and focus on the clients that we're working with? So how do we work that out where we are processing, or maybe we're going through certain feelings and certain emotions with someone, depending on what we're going through, because we can be in different stages of that processing. And then we still have to be available for other folks. So how does that impact? How can it potentially impact your work with other clients? And instead of putting in the chat box, if you could raise your hand and speak to that, that'd be great. So you're going through these feelings, and a lot of them you identify. How can potentially it affect other clients you work with or your work performance? Go ahead, Lisa. Good morning. I mean, good afternoon.
Thank you so much, Diana, for allowing me to go. I just wanted to say how it impacts my work is the fact that I can sometimes become fearful and anxious about being present with other people because the fear of, is this going to happen again? Will I miss another opportunity to support? And so, but definitely knowing that I have people that can support me encourages me to stay in the moment. And so I guess it's two sides to a coin. The first side of it is, do I continue to do this work? And the other side of it is, well, yes, I continue to do this work because I want to continue to show up and be supportive in ways that I can, and ensuring that I am aware of those places and spaces where I might feel sad or devastated, some of the things that people put in the chat box. So it's two sides to the coin.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. I appreciate that. It sounds like you've been thoughtful about this whole thing. Someone else was going to ask something? So anyone else wants to add? So like, all right, so you're going through these emotions, these feelings. How can that potentially affect your work with other folks, with other clients? Go ahead, Lynn.
I've found that in the work as well, that I have had to put an emotional boundary in place to protect myself from getting too close to people, and still being able to maintain my role, as the peer, to be able to work alongside people. And it's not always easy, because sometimes you get surprised and you lose somebody. But that's something that's affected how I work with my people, is maintaining that boundary.
So that's a strategy that's helped you. That's really awesome. And I know that can be, of course, you have to do with emotions is going to be challenging, but it says a lot that you were able to kind of, like I said, let me find a way to be able to still do the work and not let this affect them. And you used your own strategy. This is great for us to, share with one another. Thank you for that. Julie.
I would say what happens to me is I lose my confidence, actually. And then I might start second guessing how I interact with others. And it can snowball if I'm not careful.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I guess that's part of the reason why Lisa also mentioned that when the support systems are in place, and we are definitely speaking to that. But without the support systems, certainly put yourself at risk in terms of that confidence level, and then just your efficacy. Thank you. Angela.
So in my job, sometimes the clients know before I do if something's happened. So it's more like helping them process what they're feeling before I could address my own feelings. But I think it's also important to remember that this is part of the nature of the disease, and it's not necessarily a failing on our side. And I try to use it as motivation to listen to what the clients are, what their needs are, and to help provide, support to them, and, and concentrate on the areas that they're in need of.
Okay. So as you spoke to a couple of different things, because you also talked about you spoke about how making sure you help the clients through that. And at first I started to think, I said, where are you? And then you said, but use that in a way to rechannel that energy is kind of like what I heard, to help others and still not forget you. So thank you for that. Desiree?
Yeah. Similar to what Angela had mentioned, sometimes the clients do know before you know. And what I try to do, I try to process it in the group. And sometimes, depending on the client, I may feel sad, depressed, surprised because they were doing so well, and out of nowhere, this happened. I may have missed something. So for me, I definitely try to for my self-care, my mental health, I definitely process it with my supervisor during supervision. And I may also go home, do some type of relaxation technique, listen to music just to relax a little bit and not bring the work home. So that's something I had to work on. I've been in the field for a minute, so this is something that's like a work in progress, and I have to work on that on a daily basis.
Thank you for saying that. I remember, making sure, you do certain things for yourself. It really helps, if we can get caught up in do a whole other training of the psychological, emotional, cognitive parts of our wellness. We can do that, but that's not what we're going to do right now. But you did remind me of something. I remember when I first got in the field, and my supervisor at the time used to tell me, "You can't take your work home." And I said, "Yeah, okay." I said, "That makes sense. I know I don't get paid till after 5. How do we do that?" Do you know I never got an answer? Just like you say, Desiree, it was a work in progress. We kind of learn. We go to trainings, we take ideas, we get exposed to different activities, and then we find what works for us. But it's a conscious commitment to doing that. My concern is that sometimes we're so overwhelmed, we're required to do so much that kind of lose sight. Oh no, I'm going to take care of me later, and let me take care of this first. Let me take care of this documentation. Let me take care of that client and all that, and forget myself somewhere in the process. And in a couple of days, I'm not feeling as intense. Those feelings are not as intense. And I said, "Oh, I'm better. Let me just keep going to work." And it's not necessarily realized. Maybe it manifests itself and comes out later in some other kind of way. That's hugely important. So this is great. Thank you for this. Let me just go over some information that I have. And so I wanted to share with you. So in New York, let me stop. Okay. In New York, they did a survey, and this was in 2019. The overdoses were increasing before the pandemic came our way. We were already at the upper end, increasing our overdoses. We were seeing that in New York and throughout the nation. And so, but in New York, they decided to do an informal survey, and they found that 39% of providers or professionals like yourself, of recovery support specialists, of clinicians, of counselors, indicated, almost 40% indicated that their work had been impacted by one or more overdose clients that's in the agency. And so it wasn't always someone that had to be on your caseload, but it's just the fact that it was in your environment. Sometimes you pass people on in the hallway, even if you don't know who this person looks like. It has to do with the place where you work at. And so there's a very personal association, not just a professional one there. And so folks feel that anyway. So 16% of these providers have considered leaving their current job. I have a colleague, a friend, who actually left their current position and stopped doing direct services and went into an administrative perspective and an executive level, and because they didn't want to do direct services anymore, so they didn't want to put themselves at risk for that. And that's to the degree that someone experiences the situations where we lose a client. And so 54% indicated that a client in the agency had passed away within the last 12 months. 32% had indicated that it was someone on their caseload. And so when we think about this is so much more common. I'm not so sure we always think about it or talk about it unless I'm talking to the other counselor that I kind of, that I'm probably friends with or close with or sometimes have lunch with. This is not necessarily a conversation or data that comes out, like average conversation topic, and at an everyday level in our settings. And so sometimes some of the things we hear, I'm going to ask a couple of folks to kind of read from this. I'm going to read the blue, and then I am going to ask Alberto, help me out if you read the red font, the red lettering. Is that okay?
Got it.
Okay. So these are some from frontline staff. This is what folks have been saying for when they did this informal survey. Our management staff refused to process and have any dialogue about the deaths. Get up, Bert.
It is emotionally taxing to give all you can to the client, but sometimes it isn't enough. You want to help everyone, and when someone dies, you also feel like you failed them, which is right. That's the way I feel also.
That's right. Okay, thank you. I've become more hypervigilant and aware of increased risk.
Feeling of loss, confusion, slow work product, and receive no outlet within the agency.
Okay. Difficulties, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Difficulty sleeping.
It causes staff depression, malaise, and fear of further losses, as was spoken to.
I've had several losses, several clients in my caseload died, overdose, when I worked in an agency setting, and even more died within the agency as we worked, specifically with young adults who often use opiates. There was a major impact on staff and clients.
All right, thank you, Albert. I'm not sure where you're coming from, but I appreciate that you read with me. So these are actual statements from colleagues and professionals like you. Does this sound familiar to anyone? Okay. So while I'm gonna say something. I appreciate the perspective of some of you are the way you're sharing, and when you go through these situations, you are actually looking to provide yourself the support that you need, and that is amazing. We don't want to lose sight of ourselves, and unfortunately, I think the overwhelming burden that comes with doing this kind of fantastic work, kind of helps us sometimes lose sight of ourselves. And so here I'm wondering is how much our settings may be challenged with being able to provide a support in the moment. And sometimes what they do is pretty, they do give support, but I want to talk about how some postvention activities can be more available and more reliable for you folks to consider. So it's not just what you know, it's also what can be done with your staff, what can be done in your setting, what can be done with your peers. And so I'm going to go over some of that. I got some messages here. I said, okay. I'm seeing a lot of folks who are talking about what they, the losing and having a safe space. Yeah, let's talk about that. So with a lot of folks, some of the things that they mentioned that is associated with the overdoses, folks feel shame or sometimes stigma or isolation may be part of the overdose rates, or it may be part of what ends up affecting or helping providing may start to experience themselves. Their feelings of blame, relief, and guilt and regret, and a lot of you folks talk to that. Like in way is it that when we don't have a lot of information and we can't put the scene together, we have all these questions about how did it happen? How could have it happened? What was the trigger? What made, all the details. For some reason, our minds kind of grasp on that, especially when we're shocked. We kind of look for answers to rationalize the situation, to help make sense of it, at least in the moment. It's just a natural thing that many human beings, we just naturally do. Relationship status at the time of death, sometimes that has something that's associated with the overdose. The death may occur during a period of non-contact. Sometimes we lose folks to treatment, and we've heard that somebody who was lost to care may have been the one who transpired through an overdose. Trauma around being present for an overdose. I've had colleagues who've had on site, they may have had a client and they have overdosed in the restroom. We've had all kinds of situations that nobody sees like you folks see. And so the challenges associated with that is the impact. And so for professionals, when you learn of an overdose, you might find yourself in a daze. It's possible that you have a hard time not concentrating on your work. It's not just shock, but it's just the fact that it may have been someone you know. It depends on the different associations and different factors that connects them to you. The daily routines, you might feel a little overwhelmed with your routines when they were routines and things that you had to do on a daily basis that were not that big of a deal, that they were pretty much just kind of standard to you. And all of a sudden now the same things are feeling overwhelming to you. And you may not think that it's connected to the impact of having a client loss in your environment, but it may very well be. So maybe you're an avid reader, you can't focus, and that's kind of part of the concentration issue. You can't accomplish as much as you're used to in a given day. So listen, so talking about grief and loss, I just wanted to mention some things. There's some myths around what sometimes some of us think that that grief should be. And I've heard this before. I've been told this before. It's like, so the griefs, time that there should be a time limitation. That that griefs last a year, or that there's a lifetime time frame or time limit for grief. Like you should be through. You should be past that by now. If someone tells you that, that is like so disregarding and so uninformed. Appropriateness of grief. That a professional relationship includes grief symptoms after death. So, for some reason, it's like, wait, because you're a professional, you should be disassociated emotionally. One of the biggest things, and I mentioned at the beginning, is the empathy we bring that starts to initiate an alliance with our clients. We're not robots. And so the intensity of grief is related to the quality of the relationship, whether it's dysfunctional, complicated, the intensity of grief is, and that's not necessarily so. It could be someone you don't even know, but they will come into your agency and you can still have an effect of it. The intensity of grief is always related to the nature of the relationship. Grief can present itself in so many different ways, like sadness or depression only. That's also not true. It's a lot broader. The goal of grief is to move on or get over it. That's really disregarding the humanness in all of us, because that's not how we process. Unless you're a light switch, that's not typically how we process situations, grief or any kind of feelings. Grief and depression are the same. That's certainly a myth. So let's talk about this a little bit. Grief and loss in a clinical setting, it can be strong, sometimes overwhelming, and sometimes you don't necessarily feel it initially, maybe because you are in disbelief, and maybe sometimes you'll have a reaction later. But symptoms can include feelings of shock, horror, and intensity, and sometimes it's increased anxiety, and sometimes, and like when you wish. I forget who was sharing about being with another client and not necessarily and fearing or maybe being anxious or anticipating that it might happen again. Even having emotional withdrawals behind all this. So grief is pretty complex and really depends on the person. If it looks different on different people, it's because people are different. We have different philosophies, different coping skills, different levels of resilience, and on any given day, things look different. And there's so much more to that. It's very unpredictable in its impact. Sometimes we ourselves can be very surprised at our response or reaction to a loss, which I think these days we're more likely to see our humanness because after 3 years of dealing with the pandemic and different versions of it, we have had to deal with loss in so many different ways. And at the same time, when it comes to someone overdosing also, and these are part of the work that you do, it could be especially impacting. So grief symptoms, they can last anywhere from a few weeks to many years, can include both psychological and behavioral components. It's like some people may have like acute somatic symptoms. I remember someone telling me yesterday I was working with some professionals that was sharing with me about how sometimes, their stomach starts to turn and they get nauseated, when the last, and it was speaking to me about the last time they had a loss. And so these kind of things are not unheard of, and they're pretty common, as a matter of fact. And if we find ourselves all of a sudden something different, like a shortness of breath or having headaches, something like that, and which is not necessarily common with us, and this happens maybe just a little while after learning of someone's loss, this might be part of the grief process for you. So the intensity and duration is really important to say that there is no time frame on it. As I was saying before, it's not predictable that way. Sometimes intensity is contingent upon the other details of the situation. It's not just the shock factor that someone mentioned earlier about it being unexpected. Sometimes we learn about more traumatic, more violence in it. So the intensity of certain situations kind of speak to the intensity is how some of the feelings or the impact would be on us. There and some ambiguity surrounding the intention of the victim. Like sometimes we want to think about, they knew about this, but they did it anyway. How many times do we make sure that our clients know about, train them in naloxone with the naloxone kids, we let them know about how to work around the issues around, fentanyl, even though they're supposed to be they're in care, and we're hoping they're abstinent, if that's the kind of program that you're working with. There are folks that are just reducing their consumption with opioid. It's completely, it's a kind of different animal, but we get surprised when some folks, after we give them so much information, that they make a choice that is not healthy, that might put them at risk, and they have an overdose. Sometimes we forget that it takes a while before the neurological processes and the brain functions go back to a healthy way of processing information. And that has to do with repetition, it has to do with the interventions you folks use, it has to do with the consistent support that you give. For a variety of different reasons, folks end up overdosing. So the impact to us and the way our minds wander can last for a long period of time. Their typical grief, what we tend to see with most people, is intense feelings that kind of abate over time. I won't say that we get desensitized, but we do kind of somehow adjust to the fact that this is not uncommon. The reason I even show you the statistics is because this is it's happening at such high rates that it is such a common thing. There was a time when I was doing treatment, it was a time where other than one of the other past waves, that we had in with the opioid overdose increases, most times they said you didn't hear about an overdose as often. Today we hear overdose quite a bit. So intense feelings do tend to abate over time for most people, but not always. Periods of intense sadness are normal. Sometimes you are just in a place where you're processing your feelings, you are aware, and you're still making sure that you're doing your work or living your life. And that where you might have this episode where extreme sadness can come. Eventually, we do go back to we have a resiliency factor in us that we tend to adjust, and we can go back to enjoying our relationships, staying productive at our work and other things, and when we're able to remember the deceased with less pain after a while, we can do that. Eventually we reconcile our emotions. And then there's other types of grief, and this is what we start to look for. Try to be aware of in case we notice this with ourselves. In complicated grief, there are intense and long-lasting feelings. When they don't abate over time, that is a concern. And so strong feelings of anger and bitterness, and something that, and think of it from the perspective that it's not common for you to have this, that for you to go through this. So constant fear and anxiety, the inability to enjoy things. Like nothing is as important or as enjoyable, or with the things you used to do, or you stop doing some things that were really satisfying, and you stop doing those. Avoiding certain situations that might remind you of the grief. Sometimes folks feel like that's the best way to deal with grief, is to avoid situations. It may or may not be helpful. A deep grief that continues for years is complicated grief. That is more of an issue to consider getting support for. Impairment in different functional areas, including your personal relationship, when it impacts and and plays a part with your family members, with your partner, with your children, that can be a sign. It can be directly related to the grief that you're processing or going through behind a client loss. So it can be debilitating in significant ways for years after the death. Certainly opportunities, certainly the situations where we could probably use support and maybe get specialty care. So one of the things we've heard a lot about, and sometimes it's like traumatic grief. And so there's a difference between trauma and grief. And so trauma feels like, oh, as a matter of fact, let me just stop to share, because even though I showed it to you, can you folks discern between trauma and grief? What's the difference? Oh, how do you understand it? Is there a difference? There's going to be a quiz at the end.
Well, for me, trauma is kind of, so, it's an effect or something that happens as a result of some sort of, incident, whereas, and if you don't process it or manage it, it can create, like it said on the slide, like almost a feeling of things being unreal. There's like disassociation episodes, things like that, which don't necessarily happen with grief. And yeah, that's how I see it.
Okay. All right, thank you, Julia. Anyone else want to add to that?
I would say that trauma is a situation that happened, and grief is just a process that you kind of like trying to get over it.
And that's kind of like what you want to do with that, and that and probably different types of feelings. Let me help you out there. So when we think about trauma, think about your trauma-informed care trainings that you've taken. Now I know you've taken. I know you've taken it because I've given some of them. I know you've taken it. So trauma tends to be our way of interpreting a situation. So threatening, something that might be dangerous, something that's threatening. So that trauma is part of that. So a good way to think about grief is that it's like someone is really sad. So those are two very distinct reactions or responses we can have to situations. And this got some really good things coming in this chat box. I'm going to look at this. The nature of events, okay, determine the difference. Grief is traumatic. Grief can be traumatic. Those details that we always seek to try to make sense of a situation, and we hear some of the really graphic details of some situations that some of our folks have gone through, yeah, that can traumatize us in our grief. That can have an aspect, that can have a layer, a dimension that's added to what we're going through. But a lot of times grief by itself is, we are processing in our humanness, we are processing the sadness of loss. Now you put this together and you have layers of different feelings that you're being impacted by. Hi, Barbara, please share with us.
No, when you mention grief can be traumatized, can be a trauma, can become a trauma if the person or we are unable to cope with it through years. And I have particularly a couple of clients that had they lost someone, they still grieving. So it became not only a grieving issue, but a trauma problem. So I just wanted to mention when you mention grieving becomes a trauma, I have a couple of clients like that. They're not able to cope, and it's just not ability. Because you were mentioning in the slides how we can go to our regular life eventually. But there is trauma, there is no going back to the regular life without that issue overwhelming that person. Yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara. So traumatic grief does exist. Traumatic grief has to do with the different layers and dimensions on top of each other. That cumulative effect can be very intense for some of us, or it can last longer and not as intense, but last for a long time. Lisa, go ahead.
So one of the things, I wanted to say about, the whole, incident that we're talking about, or issues that we're talking about. I remember I used to work in a federally qualified health center, and all of our patients that I was working with, I used to supervise around white program. And, all of our patients were living with HIV. And I remember, and it certainly piggybacks on or kind of go along with what we're talking about, is the fact that one of our patients died. She was on her way home and she dropped dead on her front lawn. So I went to work the next day and I was upset. I was crying about it because I had just seen her like 2 weeks before. And so my supervisor said, well, you knew what you signed up for. This is the nature of the work. And so there was never an opportunity to have a safe space to grieve. So for me, it wasn't all of the nature of her dying. It was just how the agency, the organization responded. And that within itself was traumatic because, that was the only thing that she could say to me. Well, this is the nature of the work. You signed up for this. So it's almost like just get back on the horse and just get to work and just do what needs to be done, because we're trying to pull money in. We're trying to, have all of this wonderful data so we can continue to do what we do. But not one time did she allow, or did she have that space, or that safe space for me to experience what I needed to experience, or anybody else who had gone through the same thing. We just wasn't allowed to do that.
And that's a shame. And it's a heck of a learning experience when you went through that. Thanks for sharing that, Lisa. And so I think, and I tend to look at two different perspectives, even when it comes to the work that we do. Has the side that does not see that that malleable human side of you, you're the person who has to go through those processing in order to give the agency the numbers they need. In order to do that, you have to take care of your staff. Staff wellness is essential. So even if the bottom line is about the numbers, and it's the nature of the work, no matter how much someone minimizes that, staff wellness is imperative. So now I'm going to go back to the human side. The human side for me would be, okay, so I have to make sure that I do something to make sure I put out certain activities or I arrange certain protocols in a certain way. So when my staff goes through these experiences, that we can take care of them, that we can provide them some kind of support to help them heal. So right now, we have to take care of our clients, but we have to take care of our staff too. It's not linear that way with just the client community. In order to be able to be in a position to support the client community, we have to support you first. So I can look at the bottom line, but I also got to, but as an executive, I would have to also look, all right, how is my staff getting along? Do they have their needs met? What's their wellness process? Because that is essential to having you folks being able to be supported so you will be able to continue your work. So one hand kind of feeds another. We cannot dismiss that our staff, they're actually human beings. You guys are humans, right? No robots here. Okay. So, and I think folks kind of lose sight of that in the trajectory as they're focused on making sure the organization's still doing what they got to do, kind of forgetting, well, there's human beings here who are working with human beings. So thanks for mentioning that. Dwayne, hi.
Hi. I think it's a fairly common thing for agencies to maybe recognize that they should give you space and provide support. But the bottom line is it just really doesn't happen that way in a lot of cases. You don't get the space that you need to begin that healing process. I had a similar situation like Lisa's where at the time I was working as an intensive case manager. And as an intensive case manager, you meet with your person very, often, and you really get to know them. You get to know their families. And I had an individual who died, and this individual did not have a family. So I had to do research into his past psychiatric histories to find, and I was able to find one living relative that he had who was out of state. It was the person I'm in New York. The relative was in Connecticut. Had to prepare his funeral arrangements, which involved a pre-cremation. I had to dispose of his belongings. And again, in terms of getting a minister, I had to do that as well. Now, in the process of doing that, I was able to say to myself, well, I think I took care of him very well in life, so I'm doing this at death. But when the trauma really struck for me is after going through all of that and after the funeral, a day later, my supervisor handed me another case to replace because numbers were important. I wasn't ready for that. So that for me was the traumatizing event in all of this. I must say, the person died of natural causes, but it didn't matter. The death was still shocking to me.
You were very involved in all that. That says a lot about you. So thank you for all that. You really put yourself, you've really involved your heart in a big way. That's going beyond the scope of your profession.
Well,
So,
actually, in this particular job, it probably, I suppose I didn't have to go to quite the extent,
Mhm.
but there was no one else who
Right.
was available to give this
Mhm.
man a decent burial, to make plans for that. So
and thank you for that. Thank you for
yes,
sharing that with us. What it brings up for me in terms of what we're talking about here is, I mean, I know clinical supervision is very difficult these days. I know we have folks who are specifically trained. If I'm a peer, I need my clinical supervisor to help me continue to develop in a healthy way as a professional, as an individual within the context of my work. And when I have situations, I need that type of support to help me process. Whether it's a situation using interventions, whether it's a clinical process, or there are other abstract things like, hey, feelings, well, what do you know? Or a situation like losses, and not having the supervisor to be able to try to ask you, let's see where you're at and let's see your health and maybe even offer an idea of like, do you need a couple of days? To considering, what you that you work closely with helping this person, since after they transition. Our supervisors checking in on our wellness because that's part of that development process. That's part of it. And so that really speaks to a really important point here. In our work, we don't always have the most effective clinical supervision. I think a lot of folks are being put in that position, and while they are learning and building their own skills, they're still supporting staff. So I love that part, and I certainly want to acknowledge that. And then there are times when we have a situation like that, and the human side of us is dismissed, the feelings and the potential mourning and the grief that we're going through is dismissed. That's concerning, and that's the whole point of this. It is great for us to understand that when we're going through certain feelings, we recognize certain things, and we got to do certain. We probably should do certain things to process and get ourselves to wellness and give ourselves time to grieve and recover. But it's also helpful when our organizations see that we need that kind of support. Oh, let me do this. I don't know why my box goes crazy like that. So when you think about grief, when you think about traumatic grief, there's a lot of the supports is essential. Timing of those supports is also key. So traumatic grief is a normal grief response to a loved one's death or someone who you know that's perceived to be horrifying, has those extra dimensions of unexpected of some of those details that can be very graphic and very intense. Now, for professionals, in addition to the grief responses, sometimes you might start feeling, and I think some of you mentioned some of this, but this helplessness and guilt is some of the things you mentioned kind of first, right? Sometimes some folks take responsibility. They feel like they play some kind of part in someone's overdose. It was mentioned, Julie mentioned about the confidence, how that's diminished. Sometimes we're hypervigilant. That was mentioned really true in different words. There's times, and I remember a couple of professionals one time told me that they were so angry because they felt betrayed because they were available and they didn't come to them to help them. And that's really grief, really speaking to a person. And so what do you do in the aftermath? What steps can or does your agency take in the aftermath? And that's really the question. That's really where we're at here. And so we've already started to talk about what happens when we don't get that kind of help. So what are the steps that you've taken for yourself? So when our organization, when our settings are not necessarily prepared, then we have to take matters into our own hands, something we should do anyway. But there is two different questions here, the organizational response and our response. So let me go here. This is where opioid overdose postvention comes in. So, and this is really, and this started, I know there has been the Department of Health, Office of Mental Health, and as well as New York State OASIS, Office of Addictions Services and Supports. And so both entities and other entities across the nation are starting to look at the importance of within the landscape of overdoses and how it's been going these days and the last few years, the need to use postvention activities to be able to support the workforce. So it's an organized response in the aftermath of a suicide or a loss. I know we call this suicide, and that's just and I get a little kind of sidelined when New York City or some of the entities call it a suicide. It's not necessarily intentional. We don't know that. What we do know is an overdose is that we lose a client. Let's just put it simply like that. But the postvention activities is really about what an organization can do. And immediately, I'm not talking about 3 months later, immediately when there is a loss, what ways can they support you individual professionals or you as a whole, and how to mitigate the possible effects that the event can have on you. And so some of the key components to successful implementation of postvention, and postvention is a way of kind of looking at it from a prevention perspective, because you want to have it ready when certain situations do occur, right? So clear documented protocols for risk identification management postvention. I wanted to include that. That comes directly from New York State OASIS. Training staff, and that's part of the reason why we're here. Agencies can invest in both prevention and postvention initiatives. And so that really starts from the top down, not necessarily in that direction. It's inclusive and that everybody should be involved in that, understanding how to come together, how to look at the existing policies and protocols, and what kind of supports you currently give staff. Now, when somebody has, when a staff has a family loss, we have it built in within within our organization and our duties and responsibilities. And HR lets us know that we have time that we could take off. When we're going to have a kid, we have time we can take off maternity leave. When we have a loss in our family, we have time that we can take off. So we know that for that, we don't necessarily have written protocols for a client loss. So thinking about what can someone do? So there's a loss, it just happened just yesterday. What can happen? So organizations, agency can consider incorporating within their protocols a way to be able to debrief staff. So the main purpose of debriefing staff is really to be able to review the event, acknowledge and recognize that it happened, and help folks process, bringing them together. And so what the management can do is help conduct a staff debriefing. And now this is very specific. This is not something that you plan at the end. You have to plan this ahead of time and strategize appropriately. So what you want to do, what the organization wants to do is consider a place where they can bring staffs together. This is not something that you mandate your staff to. This is something that you suggest staff can attend. You set it up where staff is going to come together. Overdose deaths impacts all staff, direct and indirect staff. It has impacted. We've heard of folks being impacted at the executive level. We've heard of people in HR being impacted. And these are folks that don't necessarily interact specifically with the client community or that particular person. But it is an opportunity to bring people together in a very private space, a confidential space, and voices can be heard. And so some of the things that you may, that the agency can consider is to keep the group small, small at first, and not necessarily everybody at first. The staff that is directly involved with that individual, you want the data, the researchers and the experts recommend that the direct staff be debriefed first. They are more likely to feel this at a degree or at a level or at intensity more deeply than most others. Everybody else is going to feel it. And I'm not trying to minimize anything. I'm just saying, but you want to get with the direct staff first. And then you also want to then include everyone else in. And some of the things that can be helpful, and we do give this, is tips for conducting an effective debrief. Now, this is just a short version of a bigger training where we can help your settings, your executive leadership, and your decision makers understand how to do this. But some of the tips include how to have debrief. So if you're going to set up, okay, where you can instantly go into this process, then you want to be able to coordinate this to be able to have certain persons who might lead the conversation and certain persons who will do it in a way where they build an atmosphere where people feel safe. So keeping the conversation factual and the tone non-accusatory. And so it's not unheard of that when during grief times, or someone who may not be feeling or might be, whether they're involved directly or not, that someone might start to feel that someone else may be at fault. This is not what you want to make sure that that environment is about. It's really supposed to be a safe environment so people can share what they're going through if they want to. So it's important not to place staff on the defensive. So keeping questions to open-ended questions. Yeah, and we already know that open-ended questions encourages participation, communication. And so that's what we want to do with our staff. We want to make sure that the person that is going to facilitate this kind of environment, this kind of debrief, is aware and skilled in doing this. So you have to make sure that the person that is a person or a couple of people that need to be available to do this have these skill sets and have this mindset and and understand how to do this. So keep things simple. Debriefings about who, what, when, and where of the patient. Keep it very simple, succinct. Avoid going into details of death. The last thing the mind needs is so many things for it to kind of go everywhere. So you want to know what the exact details are. If you have them, give them that and keep it, keep it like just to the facts. And not necessarily just look to, kind of consider what could possibly come up. So the person who is actually guiding the debrief should help focus and guide the conversation that way. Going into details of the death and avoid sharing suspicions is really key here. So that's really what I mean. So the debrief shouldn't take more than 30 minutes. It's not a mandate. People do not have to go, do not have to talk, but you want to be able to offer it to your staff and prepare for the debriefing by making sure that you yourself, as the person or the person who is conducting a debrief, is aware of their own feelings so they can be able to be objective and guide others in their communication and their sharing. And so supporting staff members. So here's when I start to talk about very specifically about peer recovery support specialists. And so in addition to, meeting people where they're clients where they're at, peers have their own type of alliance with the clients. And so sometimes it impacts their own recovery process. And so recovery capital, which is the resources and the strengths and the different opportunities and activities that people engage in to sustain and maintain their recovery process, this becomes really, really important here. And it's something that all professionals can borrow from. And so a staff member who's lost a client to suicide may experience responses similar to the emotions and reactions of survivors of a loved one. It's very close because someone who has had that own lived experience of substance use and can have their own profound impact behind a loss. So staff may replay the last interactions with the client, wondering if there was something that they missed. This is not too dissimilar from what other providers in other capacities would go through. The professional self-report feelings of numbness or disassociation after experiencing multiple client deaths in their agency. So these are things that when it's happening is why I stress, and I appreciate that Dwayne shared with us his situation, really emphasizes the need for supervision. And so when we think about things that we could do, staff members may be hesitant to openly discuss their feelings with supervisors. And that may happen sometimes. So if you are, let me ask you all, if you are in a position, you are in a situation where, let's say you don't have, maybe some agencies right now are going through transitional periods. Some places may not necessarily have a clinical supervisor on hand, at the moment. And sometimes, and what I do, and what I try to tell my colleagues, what I used to do is I used to seek supervision elsewhere. That's for me. That's what I do. I don't know if we all do that, but if it's not here, I know that I need to continue to develop. I need someone else's expertise to help me see things that I can't see for myself. And so when we don't have that available, or when we cannot necessarily feel comfortable sharing our situation with someone, what do? Or what have you done? What has been successful for you? When you don't feel like you can openly discuss your feelings with supervisors and managers. Go ahead, Porterfield, I see you.
Yeah, what has been helpful for me is talking to my coworkers. See, I work with an experienced staff. We've been together for so many years. So if I feel down and need to talk, just going to them, and it helps alleviate any type of stress I have. That's been very helpful. And we share different experiences with one another, and we're very supportive of each other. So that works for me.
Thank you. Awesome. That's a great idea. Actually, it's one of the strategies that is emphasized in postvention. And with peer recovery support specialists and colleagues and counselors, we tend to gravitate to our peers. We do tend to gravitate. It's like, do you know what I just said? I can't understand what I'm going through. Do you have a minute to talk? Super, super important. So thank you for that. Any other suggestions? If you're not comfortable, for whatever the reason, it's not about unpacking that at the moment. It's about seeking support that you need at that moment. So what else can you do? Lynn.
I run a tiny chat group of former coworkers who are social workers and peers and things like that. And I found that having that to fall back on, we're not in the same counties anymore, but we check in with each other constantly, especially with a lot more overdoses happening in our respective counties. But I have found that that's been a boon, because I don't feel like I can get that support right now at work. We're having some turnover.
Yeah.
It's always something I can fall back onto, because we're all in the same field. We're dealing with similar things, and it's just nice to be able to have support.
I think that's a great idea. I've learned that there are some folks that are keeping themselves, even when they're not there anymore, because staff moves out. You were talking about the turnover. Yeah, we don't necessarily leave the field. We might leave. We might just leave the setting. It's nice to stay connected. That's a great support system. And seeing how we're in this wonderful virtual world that we love so much, I want to take advantage of that. I mean, we can do that even without having to do it in person, even though I think also do it in person and getting together and having dinner, having that coffee break, it's also just as important. So thank you for that, Lynn. And if you don't have it like that, you might want to consider starting one. I would imagine it wasn't that difficult to start, Lynn. Yeah.
Nope, it's a Facebook Messenger group, and it's really easy to set up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so I see. I'm going to read a couple of messages here. Let's see. Best supervisor I had was an outside clinical supervisor. That I can relate with. It was helpful to have someone who was not in the agency. Oh, it probably was more objective. That's great. So I run a charity. There's no management above me. I have to use multiple avenues of care and support. There you go. And so you have to use what are your resources available? So when we think about, and I love to borrow this from the peer recovery specialists, I hope you folks don't mind, but the recovery capital that a lot of us have, our resources that are available, really key, not to just do it in hindsight or just wait till a situation happens, is to be prepared ahead of time and know, okay, this is where I can go to do this. A lot of the work, a lot of the suggestions that we are discussing here is what we do with our client community. We need to specifically use those same kinds of strategies for ourselves. Doesn't have to be the same resources, but they can be very similar processes. We just don't want to forget ourselves, because we love what we do and we need to take care of ourselves. Otherwise, we cannot support others. So a lot of the strategies, we already have the capacity. We just don't always think about doing it for us. So contact HR department and and we can go to EPA too and kind of go in your union for a delegate, and you can do that. If you're comfortable doing all those things, that's great. If you have those available, readily accessible, that's fantastic. And I think that's the main thing, is to know what can you do in the immediate moment. Who can you call? Where can you go? Because that means you are consciously acting on knowing that you need help in that moment, that you need support in that moment. When we dismiss it, when we leave it for later, when we have to do the clients first, when we have to do the staffing first, when this other emergency or this other crisis comes first, we fall somewhere in the back and we don't necessarily catch up to us because we're good like that. I know we bring a lot of big hearts into the work that we do, but that big heart has to include us. And so let me bring up some of this. So one of the things we want to do when we are facilitating groups, I've seen it happen. I've been in that, witnessed the experiences when someone is sharing something very profoundly, and I'm not talking about the clients, I'm talking about colleagues. I've shared something that is affecting them, and someone tries to correct their statement. They're not cursing, they're just sharing their perspective and what they're going through, and someone does come out and say, no, that's not what it means. It means that you're going through this. It's like, no, do not interrupt to correct someone's statement of their expression. That is not supportive. What can happen to a provider is that they can retrieve inside and say, okay, you're not the person they're going to talk to. And maybe they won't even process their feelings. So provide validating supportive statements. And so if your colleagues are coming to you, or you need someone to go to, make sure that you can receive this. Active listening is not just for clients, active listening is for ourselves as well. And so some of the things that we can consider doing is screening for like high risk, right? So sometimes complicated grief assessments are available. If you can seek help for yourself, there's nothing wrong with you seeing how you can use a 5-question tool to be able to try to assess where you're at. If you're going to be honest with you, this is not something to show anybody else. This is just for you. So you're likely not to lie to yourself. You're likely not to rationalize to yourself. You're likely going to be honest about your symptoms so you can see where you're at. Then you could choose to do what you want to do. But it's not a bad thing to use a tool for yourself. There's also a 19-question assessment tool. But I typically go for like the simpler ones because I'm usually in rush world and I need simple, concise, and that is more directed for me. So you can use either one though. So here's and then here's a copy of it too. And I just uploaded it, but this is what it is. And it's really about, you're looking at, how much are you having trouble accepting the death of whoever the person is? Does it interfere with your life in some kind of way? Are you having like recurring thoughts? Are you having a hard time focusing? And so the questions really speak to that. And then you can assess yourself. So one of the things that we do always encourage is self-care. And you've been to trainings before, we always talk about self-care. Yes, we talk about one of the things you can do to go take a vacation and all that, but a vacation is not readily accessible once you've experienced someone's loss. So managers and supervisors can think of certain things, in order to promote self-care practices. And here's the thing about supervising, and here's the thing about HR and all the executive leadership, is really when you have staff, when we're all working in our environment, do we have folks who are encouraging us to take care of ourselves? Because the more you are in this people field, the more you're working with opioid use disorders and the mitigating factors that a lot of their families and them are dealing with, the more you need to support that your mental health, your well-being. So our staff members are allowed, encouraged to use vacation time or personal time. Is it written in the protocols? It's something that we didn't have to experience too much before, but we've been experiencing in the last number of years. Overdoses at a rate that we've never had to before. So maybe leadership, this is a good time to start thinking about writing that in. We have it written in for that we have a certain amount of vacation days. We have it written in on our agreements to work in the agencies, that we have a certain amount of personal time that we can use certain times for after family loss. Well, let's put it let's also include in our protocols, the time needed to process and mourn and grief and heal after you have a client loss. So these are questions that the agency should consider. So this is the organization offer that time for the bereavement. Are you folks encouraged? Has the agency experienced an increase in clients? So can't help but have to look at the atmosphere, the staff atmosphere when you've had multiple losses. Are there current activities designed to promote and strengthen staff morale? One of the things that can be really helpful, is when you come together to celebrate someone who has passed. You know, so we do that when people transition out of a job after a long time. We do that for a variety of different reasons. We award people because they have done exemplary work. Well, when a client lost, one of the ways that can be helpful, supportive to staff, for each other, and even for the clients, is to be able to come together and celebrate that person. And so whether it's like, you know, sometimes we have events where the community, we invite the community and other staff, and everybody brings in a dish of the culture, or they celebrate certain folks because they were well known for certain things, certain strengths that they had. But there's a variety of different ways where we can actually come together to celebrate that person. And that's the way that can be supportive for staff and help everyone heal. Are the current counseling options? One of the first things that most people will say, well, we have an EAP. And I remember in one of my past career moves, I used to see it in the hallway. It used to be pinned up in the board, along with 1,000 other announcements of things that were available for staff, you know, or things that we had to do. So it's not always readily spoken to, but having agencies being able to like readily have say an email type of announcement of different support systems, making them available, the numbers available, time criteria, not just general information. Yeah, you could go see your EAP officer. Now, give them specific information, and some that are maybe can be accessed through technology, or some can be accessed through in person. And having that real concrete information is helpful for someone who's grieving, instead of expecting that individual, you folks, would have to go do your own research. So getting through the early days, you may feel, besides the grief, you may feel a little dreamy, a little disconnected from the world. Allow yourself a couple of days to actually go through that. Be aware the energy, the grief and shock can take. You might feel very fatigued very often, stay hydrated. Let your family or those people close to you know that where you're at and what you're experiencing, because it'll, first of all, help explain your potentially reactions you may have to folks. You might be short of patience, you might be very distant, and letting folks know that you may be going through that can be helpful for them, so they can support you. Eventually you will find meaning and joy. So be prepared. Some of us might go through roller coasters of emotions. And just because we do know ourselves having gone through certain grief processes with certain folks in our past, it doesn't mean we're going to react the same way for client losses or for every person. So it can look different depending on where you're at. So be aware that energy it takes also. If you have planned events with your family or your social group, and this might impact the grief you're going to, may impact your level of participation or your desire to even participate. And so maybe set up boundaries around that. Someone else mentioned earlier about having boundaries around that. So prepare yourself for possible well-meaning, hurtful comments from friends. And I was always curious about it, and I really got to ask you folks about this. I've had my own personal experiences about this, and I'm very curious for you. We all have really, really special people in our lives that really love us and care about us. And then we're going through a grief process, and we had just lost someone. Maybe they know about it. We shared it with them, and they give us all kinds of comments. They give us all kinds of wonderful advice. Sometimes they don't stop telling us. One of the things, sometimes, and they're telling us probably stuff that we already know. Maybe we didn't even ask for the advice. And you're the one grieving. So I want to make a suggestion, so sometimes folks who care about us so much, who are trying to give us support, they feel helpless around us because they want to do for us. And they don't, and sometimes somebody wants to show their support, and so they say things because that's the best they can do. And even though we're grieving, and that really kind of requires a little bit of patience on our side, and maybe it might encourage us to kind of keep it distant for a little while until we're in a healthier place. Because after the third person tells you what you already know what to do, you're probably going to come out in a very not as kind way. And we don't want to lose friendships here. It's like, no, I mean, I have some choice words and I'd rather not act on them. I'd rather just think of it and just kind of let it go. People try to be supportive in our, especially in our intimate world. We have people who try to be supportive. And folks are just trying to do the best they can to support us. That's great. You know, at least we know it. Just knowing that we have those in our lives that's part of the resources that we can tap into every once in a while. We know we're getting some kind of compassion and love somewhere, and that's really great. But we also got to kind of be patient. But sometimes we're hearing things like, okay, that's not really helpful right now. But it's like, but I don't want to come out with my attitude just because I'm grieving, because that's not a good excuse. So also, I just kind of want to mention that. So I will deter from my other ideas that come up to me when it comes to my friends. Anything that you folks want to add for when you have well-meaning folks who are trying to validate your feelings and trying to give you advice? Deadline.
I am one of those well-meaning folks who wants to share that with people, and it took some practice, kind of like rein myself in and just listen to the person and just let them know that I was there for them for whatever they might need, and ask them if it's okay for me to check in on them, because I was that person. I was, trying to over nurture somebody. Well, I don't know if over nurture is the right word, but you know what I mean? Just wasn't helpful.
Well, we live and learn, especially when we go through it. Okay, well, maybe we'll try different later. Thank you, Lynn. Shonda.
Hi, I had a situation where I was grieving. I lost my grandmother, and a good friend also at the same time had a miscarriage, and I couldn't hold space for myself. And she was very upset with me. Like, she stopped speaking to me. And I didn't even know, like, in the midst of it all, I just didn't know I acknowledged her, but I didn't acknowledge her because I wasn't present for myself. And so we talked about it like months later. We're not friends anymore after this, but we talked about it, and she said, well, I had a miscarriage and you shut down. And I was like, do you understand? Like, I lost my grandma. Like, my grandma was like my mother. And it was just so hard because I don't believe in funerals. So I did not go to her funeral, but I was my spiritual path, but I needed that time to like clear my mind and just kind of be just to myself. And she kept calling, and I didn't have the strength. I did not have the strength to talk to anyone. So we ended up, unfortunately, the friendship, was kind of canceled itself out. But if in this place now, if that happens, just, allow people to have that time to grieve, because sometimes we don't have the words to grieve, whether it's a patient, a family member, like we just, sometimes even as professionals, we don't have that capacity. Sometimes we need to just kind of go ground down, settle down, take a deep breath, and I ended up going to a support group because I was just like, I could not. I saw her like a week before, and the next thing you know, she's like gone. So for me, I was like, I got to get some help. I got to talk to somebody about this. And so unfortunately, I lost a friend because I didn't know how to grieve, and she didn't know how to grieve. And it was just very unfortunate. And that was probably about probably about 8 years ago now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Oh, thank you. No problem. Thank you.
It's interesting. We all process and deal with things differently, and the patience that we have with each other is the same patience that we're encouraged to use for ourselves. And it makes sense that a lot of times that because of the feelings that we're going through, that words we use, we can't take back the words we use, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that we can't come back and say, listen, I was in the middle of something. So I'm sorry for your loss, but I'm also going through a loss. So I understand that you did that. I think the very things that we always try to practice with our clients is the things we should do with us. And patience and I hate that word tolerance, patience and compassion is really huge in our work, especially because of the field that we work in, the kind of work that we do. I think when folks say what they say, I love the fact that I can look at it from a different perspective and say, I got people who support me. I mean, I always have, the words that come out of their mouth may not necessarily be the most helpful at that moment. But when I know someone's there for me, it's a lot better than feeling I'm alone. And I think as a professional, we're so focused on just what we're supposed to do in our work that even if we don't have that overall support, there's certain things, because of our experience, there's certain things we might consider doing in our opportunity we might be able to do for ourselves. At the same time, I think this is a good time to even ask you, if you were say, seeing how you gone through your own experience, what kind of suggestions do you think you would make for your agency or your setting? What do you think would be helpful and realistic within your agency in terms of having some immediate responses, immediate post-vetted activities for your setting, for your staff and colleagues? What do you think? Maybe one suggestion each person. And a lot of times our own experience is the very foundation to what can promote, wellness going forward. Gladys? Hi.
I think that for managers or supervisors can be more care if they put more attention to the staff. Like I hear for the other person that they participating in there. Normally the agencies right now, they more focus on production. We working in agency that work like a factory. We want production. And they happy with you when you produce. And when you don't produce because you feel certain feelings because you lost a patient or you lost a family member, for them, it's easy to say, it's something that is normal, was his time. They don't put attention to the staff. That's what right now we have a lot of counselors who they live in the field or they don't know what to do. And what I say is that we need to reevaluate what we're doing because it's not working. The staff is getting burned out. They're not helping the staff. They pushing the staff to produce. And that's what creates this. They ignoring complete what the staff needs. And they need to refocus. And what the staff need in order for the staff give a better service to the patients. But they don't do it anymore. It's more how much money you bring and how much bonus the supervisor and the directors can get by the end of the year for pushing us. And that is not fair. We're the one who give the service to the patients. And we're the one that we need to be prepared emotionally to offer those services, but it's not like that anymore.
Thank you, Gladys. This is why we're talking about postvention activity, because your wellness is so important to what we do. Thank you.
They don't care about your wellness. They care about the numbers. How much people you see, and they don't care if you take a lunch or not.
The interesting thing is that it would benefit agencies to take care, even if the numbers is the only reasons to take care of staff to produce. It would actually benefit incorporating postvention activities, even if that's the reason.
If the staff is happy, they can do better.
That's right. Thank you, Gladys. Kirk? Hey, Kirk.
Find that button. I was just going to comment. I think that if anything, the current rash of overdoses has emphasized to our field the need for grief and loss support and training. The early round of 2014 through 2018, this wasn't there. I wasn't aware it was there, and but I think something facilities can do to help is, one, don't throw somebody in to fill that hole right away, whether it's with the individual counselor or if the counselor's leading a group, that group needs to process and heal a little bit before they're going to admit someone else in. And so I would suggest that from that perspective. And also if you're in, to a certain extent, we're expected to be the ones showing how to heal and that we're holding it together and, you know, we're doing fine with all of this. And especially as, you know, from the male perspective, yeah, we couldn't get clean and sober alone. We can't deal with grief alone either. And so I would say that's definitely don't be afraid to ask for help. You have to ask for help. Absolutely. I'm one of those 20% who got out of counseling and now I'm a grant writer because it was just too painful to see these. That's all I have to recommend. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirk. Thank you so much. It's an interesting thing that happens to us when we build our capacity, build our expertise, and we become really good at what we do. And we think that asking for help is not our job. We're the ones who's supposed to provide the help.
Provide it.
And then it's very concerning. And it's something for us to think about. And this is really about introspection. This is really for you to think about on your own. It's got nothing to do with you sharing it with anybody else. Think about it on your own. Asking for help is actually showing strength. When you don't ask for help, that's concerning.
Yeah.
If you cannot see that in your humanness, you need support, that's going to translate in how you interact with others. It's going to translate in how you work in your job and how you provide services and how you support your clients. But it's also going to show you, it can also help a person actually get to a point where they're reeling, where they can reel from the impact of their losses, of not processing their own feelings, and puts them in a place that is very unhealthy. It can mental health issues, somatization in terms of, you know, medical issues can exacerbate, you know, start to, you know, keep your support system. They can start keeping a distance from you. And you don't want to wait till it gets that extreme or that severe for you to understand, you know what, you need to take a step back. Taking a step back and asking for help is strength. The very things we teach and instruct and try to mimic, and we should mimic for our clients, is the very same thing. So thanks so much, Kirk, for mentioning that. And I also want to say it's not an end-all process when we grieve. And no matter, even though we have had a hell of a lot of opportunity the last 3 years to practice this. And so I'm going to, because I want to go over a few things before we stop. I also want to just tell you that reframing traumatic loss is a potential for growth. Our experience, when we process in a healthy way, we also are able to thrive after learning how to survive. And so post-traumatic growth, PTG, is a theory that explains transformation that follows from trauma. You know, we help a lot of people go address the trauma in their own lives. And a lot of times we don't realize that what we're doing is rechanneling that experience to go forward in a healthier manner and also help someone else. Help others to go through it too. So if people develop different understandings of themselves, how they can relate to other people, they might be more preventive and more sensitive in how they engage. They may understand how to, you know, what to do when they are feeling their awareness may be up in such a way where after you learn to process, you know, what's helping and do certain things that are healthy for you to help, you know, your grieving process and give yourself time and other things that can be supportive, then you can use that to understand, to continue to keep your awareness at a level where you can always think back, okay, well, right now I'm not feeling just right. This is going to impact how I engage with that client. That client can be very challenging at times. You know, so I know that where my part is in my world before I even interact with others. So you can actually reframe traumatic loss and being able to process from that. You can use that and rechannel that energy. And so trauma can increase empathetic understanding and enhance clinical ability to work with clients who have experienced trauma. And this is helpful for every peer recovery support specialist. This is for colleagues. You do not have to be the clinical supervisor. If you understand what are the healthy ways and supports that you can use for you to process your grief and get to a wellness place, however you identify that, then you can take that experience and help others with that as well. So additional grief and trauma resources include, the EPA, which we mentioned before. Are there trained grief and trauma therapists available through the agency? How are they readily available? Can they be the ones who can facilitate a debrief? Do the agency policy offer the time off for bereavement? We know we have it for family. We really should start to consider including this in our protocols for staff because of the lay of the land. The opioid overdoses are just going through the roof, and it's a reality where we have to keep our wellness in place so we can help the folks we can. And so are there any local resources available to professionals who are working with grief and loss? So whether you have clinical supervision on site or you don't have it, can you seek it somewhere else? Can you seek other supports? I love the one that Julie Lynn was speaking to about getting together with other colleagues, whether they're from your job or not, getting together with other professionals who kind of understand where you're coming from and are more likely to be supportive. I think that's great. So staff, promoting staff wellness is to set a time every month for staff members to meet together and discussion, not for staffing and what are the current cases, not just for that, but in other times, especially if there's been a few client losses within the last several months. Encourage staff members to develop and engage in extracurricular activities. Sometimes when we are grieving, everything stands still. Our personal world, we go to work, we come home, and we no longer do the things that used to make us happy. Forget the barbecues. No, I'm not going out to the movies anymore. I just want to stay home. Maybe some of us feel like we're staying home and we're sulky because maybe that's part of our process. But if we stay there too long and we start doing things differently than we used to, well, we want to make sure that we are encouraged to go back and enjoy those extracurricular activities. I'm not saying dismiss the feelings. I'm not saying that to not give yourself time to mourn. You need that. But eventually come back and start to be an active participant in your life again. So limit the amount of overtime staff can have and hiring additional staff to help keep caseloads manageable. And Kirk was really speaking to that. Not to rushing to fill in a spot. And especially because and I'm thinking about how, remember when we used to have our caseloads and how we were giving clients when someone was lost to care, they automatically gave us another person. Well, guess what? If you just lost someone on your caseload, then that person should be treated with, TLC. You really should get their support before you add any new persons, any new folks, any new clients to that individual. That person's wellness should be prioritized. Modeling wellness in your own role, delegating responsibilities, taking the time off needed. So if you're have a leadership position, mimic the very things that you want or to encourage within your staff. So we talked about some of the things you might consider. I want to go through just a couple of these because this is really important because there's certain different things that we can do for ourselves. So getting involved with those with our life and opportunities, and eventually, giving ourselves time to mourn, but also getting support to help process is great. Then we want to think about the different things that we could do for ourselves and how the agency can actually put certain protocols to immediately, provide resources or supports when needed. That's important. There's ways to do it. It's not impossible. We can do it. A lot of agencies already started to do it, but many, many other agencies are minimizing the importance of that, despite the fact that these overdose rates are as high as they are. So the other things is we also want to consider other clients. We do want to consider the environment. Even if we're not getting our own feelings processed, when we're hearing it from other clients, it adds to our own situation if we're not helping ourselves. So plan to address issues such as communications, identifying vulnerable clients who might be increased suicide risk, grief support, actively working to identify potential other issues that might come up with other clients, especially when peers know who they are. Know of each other. Programs should directly address the loss and allow other clients to process and explore their own feelings. This is a time where recurrence or relapse can happen. High vulnerability, high risk factor for that. And so helping our clients understand how to process through it and how to process through is also part of the recovery. And so staff may decide to arrange a time to speak about the death with other service recipients. Start off with small groups, just like we're trying to encourage you to do with staff members. So the potential impact on clients can vary. individuals suffer from substance use disorder and different other issues. Folks who are experiencing, who are in your programs right now, who hear about a peer loss, they may be in there for a month, maybe 90 days, maybe in there for 6, 7, 8 months. But it takes a long time before that mind and that brain really works to function in a very healthy manner. Many of your programs, even your residential programs, take anywhere between a year or 2 years of a lot of times. It takes a while before folks can kind of adhere to a different lifestyle and a healthy way of living without the use of substances. And so when they're going through their feelings, if it kicks up stuff of isolation, if it kicks up their own solitude, if it kicks up any kind of feelings that may impact their recovery process, you want to be able to try to identify that. And so there may be loneliness and alienation. So you may start to observe that some of the clients may be behaving in a way where they're dismissive or they're disassociative. If you start to hear things like, people will be better off without me. Those are signs, those are things that you don't want to dismiss. If you ever heard someone who believe that that the world would be better off with me dead. It wouldn't matter where I was dead or alive, things like that. Those are your red flags. And sometimes they're not always so obvious, and I consider those obvious. But sometimes there is a desire for suicide. Sometimes suicide is probably it's potentially high risk for some folks that we have in our programs. But I have to tell you, suicide does not always come with a note. And someone does not always, and if there has depression involved, and we've been hearing a lot about this lately, but it doesn't always come with signs that are observable. So sometimes if clients are at risk, it's not because if somebody does want to take their life, they're not necessarily going to let you know if they're determined. So we don't always see it. And it's not like we're missing signs. It's just that it's just not obvious. It's not picking up and not obvious, and some people are not talking about it. So sometimes the elevated risk of suicide with some folks might be higher with some than they are with others. So when a person experiences all factors, they're strongly at risk for suicide. And so you do have, you already know this, the risk factors are higher amongst folks who have opioid use disorders, who will have reduced tolerance, from opioids, folks who used to inject drugs, folks who may have maybe even been in the same people, places, and things, situations that might be associated with whoever the peer is who transpired, people who have HIV, lung disease, and so on. So these are like folks who are at higher risk, and you want to be able to manage that. So identify strategies like, we already do naloxone trainings. We are starting to, we're trying to gather information about Xylazine and how to inform our client community about that. So we have the fentanyl testing strips. We have medication for opioid use disorder programs. We have a few different things. One of the things I do want to say, and you have way more, but I just only touched on a couple of things because once we can process with ourselves, we also have to process with our client community. One of the things I wanted to suggest is when we do have a loss, we can't automatically assume that we should show up to the funeral. Contact the family directly, extend your condolences, and that's appropriate, and I know agencies typically have those in place. But also don't assume that we can just show up. We really have to ask the family members, is it okay? I can't tell you how many times someone has told me how they still can't understand how their child, died from an overdose, or their brother died from an overdose. And they look at the addiction counselors or the peer recovery specialists as playing a part in that, because you should have got him healed, or she shouldn't have had to use it if the treatment was working. And so don't make an assumption. You just should show up, really get some clarity and some direction from the family members to see if you can show, if you can go to the funeral. Consider the parameters of confidentiality. If someone transpires, you still have to respect the confidentiality and the legal and ethical other considerations that apply. I want to, if you're really interested in this subject, and I only do this for a couple hours, but if you're really interested in the subject, there's some resources here that will be in the slides when we send you. But these have been the impact of suicide of professional caregivers. It's really important. That was updated from the Office of Mental Health in 2020. I believe the Office of New York State Oasis has a more updated, I think they also have a 2020 version, but here are some links that can take you to these resources if you wanted to go into it a little deeper. So I know this is kind of, we're kind of at the end of this presentation, but this is a reality. This is going to continue to be part of the world that we work in for now. And you are so essential to the client community. A lot of these folks cannot get better without your help, but you can't help these folks if you can't help you. So really consider how important you are and the efforts that you put in your clients. Really invest a lot of that in you first, so you can continue to do what you do. Any other strategy, any other comments, anything else that anybody else wants to add? All right then.
Hey, Diane, this is Lisa. I had to change devices, but
Okay.
I just want to say to you, thank you so much for this webinar today. It has been informative. I really appreciate everything that everyone has said. So I just wanted to just say thank you again, and I wish you well and God bless you with everything that you're doing.
Thank you all. I think you guys are the troopers. You guys are the real heroes. Just don't be afraid to call yourselves that, okay?